Welcome to the Partial Historians.
We explore all the details of ancient Rome.
Everything from political scandals, the love affairs, the battles waged, and when citizens turn against each other. I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. We consider Rome as the Romans saw it, by reading different authors from the ancient past and comparing their stories.
Join us as we trace the journey of Rome from the founding of the city. Welcome to a special episode of The Partial Historians. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G.
And Dr. G, we are ricocheting around Roman history at the moment because in our narrative episodes, we are still very much in the early Republic, but we're going right to the other end today with a delightful guest. And that is Jeremy J. Swist. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hi, glad to be back.
Now, I'm going to give you your amazing introduction here. It's hard to fit everything in, but Jeremy J. Swist has a PhD in classics from the University of Iowa. His research interests include imperial Greek and Roman historiography and rhetoric, late antiquity, classical reception in heavy metal music. He is currently Assistant Professor of Classical Studies at Michigan State University. Jeremy has published and presented extensively, and he has a particular interest in the intersection of heavy metal music and the classical world. We suggest you check out his blog, Heavy Metal Classicist, or our previous episode with him to find out more. In 2024, he translated and produced a dramatic reading of the Emperor Julian's Symposium of the Caesars, which starred some of the finest podcasters and actors in the world, which might include us. The Emperor Julian, who ruled Rome between 361 and 363 CE, is one of Jeremy's great passions, and we are thrilled to talk to him about his new volume on this unusual ruler. The book is being published by Oxford University Press and is entitled Julian Augustus, Platonism, Myth and the Refounding of Rome.
Exciting stuff. I'm looking forward to delving in.
Now, Jeremy, you are examining a much later time period than we have covered on our show so far, as I've already said. So can you tell us a little bit about who Julian was and just the basic context for his life?
Well, Julian was Roman emperor as full Augustus from 361 to 363 CE. Before that, he was what we might call a junior emperor, Caesar, under his cousin Constantius II from 355 up until 361 when Constantius died. And Julian is, as a lot of people know, known as the last pagan emperor of Rome. He was raised at least nominally Christian, and that when he was about 20 or so years old, he came under the influence of pagan Neoplatonist philosophers who were into all sorts of magic and theurgic rites. He I think he had a bit of a rebellious impulse to him, and so he essentially abandoned Christianity. Hence, he was later called the apostate by his detractors. And then he converted to philosophy, and with it, the pagan gods of Greece and Rome. And once he became full Augustus, full emperor in 361, he essentially came out of the closet and dropped the mask and said, hey, I'm pagan, I believe in the old gods, and we are bringing them back to their full worship, because at that point, the dynasty of his, which started with his uncle Constantine I, had been vigorously supporting Christianity ever since Constantine first essentially legalized it in 313 with the Edicts of Toleration, and ever since it had slowly been on its way to becoming the preferred, and eventually by the end of the century would be the quasi-official religion of the Roman Empire. And so when Julian comes along, this process had been going on for a few decades under Constantine and his sons, especially his cousin Constantius II. And so this doesn't mean that, it was necessarily too late to bring the empire back to the old ways. The majority of the empire was still pagan, but most of the people in power, right, had been preferring Christianity, and so his program, you know, was popular since most people were still pagan, but he met a lot of resistance from people higher up in power, and so he kind of undertook, a campaign of letters to try to convince his subjects, especially his literate subjects in places of power, that going back to the old ways is the way to go for the sake of the Roman Empire. And so Julian believed that with the backing of the gods, he would achieve a new refoundation of Rome and its empire, bringing it back to its old pristine values and piety and prosperity and success. And he believed that with the backing of the gods, he can score a great military victory against the Persians in order to prove, that they had his back. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well. And in the summer of 363, as he was kind of retreating back from Persia to essentially go to winter quarters, he was ambushed by the Persians, and he essentially suffered a spear wound from which he, within a day, died in his tent. He had no interest in naming a successor. His successor, Jovian, happened to be a Christian, and Jovian ended up kind of going back to the program of Constantine and his dynasty to favor Christianity again. And so there wasn't another pagan emperor after that. And the rest is history, of course.
Wow, what a turning point it sounds like. How things could have turned out differently if he'd been victorious.
Yeah.
I was going to say there's this moment where he has the potential with a victory in Persia to prove his point. And the fact that it doesn't quite go that way, everything hinges now on this arbitrary spear wound.
Yeah.
And goodness me, I love it when history has these kinds of moments. I did enjoy when you said that he sort of has a conversion to philosophy. I love thinking about it in that kind of way, where when we think about like where Rome is at this point in time, it's a complicated place, and the old rites are probably still happening for the most part throughout Rome itself. And to have this sort of dualistic approach where there's sort of Christianity on one side in the halls of power, and out in the street, you've got people still engaging in fundamental ritual practices that they're pretty sure have to be maintained in the same kind of way they've always been maintained, places his rule in this really interesting space, I think, in terms of Rome's thought about itself and also the topography of space and how it plays out. So you mentioned these letters, and in your book, you're exploring these representations of Julian, including his own representation of self. And I'm wondering, what can the study of Julian's literary persona reveal about him?
Well, as a classicist, I feel that this is sort of my entree into him, and if I can understand him as a writer, as a rhetorician, as someone who is crafting, a persona that throughout his writing seems to connect to his interests, not just in philosophy, but in being a Roman emperor. This could be a way to kind of tie things together and kind of understand how Julian saw himself and wanted his reading public to understand him independently of what other sources, contemporary and later, say about him, in order to kind of get a sense of, well, this is what he wanted through kind of the voice that is his most authentic, right? And so the challenge for me was trying to see, well, is there a consistency here? Is Julian presenting himself the same way to different audiences through different genres of literature? Because, he can be approached from so many different disciplinary perspectives, as someone who does philosophy, as again a rhetorician, as a politician, and as a satirist, right? And what I'm trying to see is, well, what is it that holds that all together and shows that he actually has a consistency of his identity that kind of informs all those different aspects of his life and his career. And I believe, based on my what I've studied is that his identity as an emperor, right, as a ruler, as a Roman ruler, okay, seems to take precedence, and everything else he does philosophically, literarily, is in service of that persona, right?
All right. So he's building up this persona for himself in order to sort of mark out his position of power.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting.
Now, we've obviously got the sense, I think, that philosophy is a pretty big deal for Julian. It plays a pretty important role in his life. So, how did philosophical ideas influence his work and his conceptions of himself?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so going back to these radical pagan Neoplatonist philosophers that that caused him to abandon Christianity, earlier in his life, basically the kind of political philosophy that they pursued, which isn't as talked about much with kind of Neoplatonism in general, because we tend to see of it as this sort of mystical kind of philosophy, or that sort of separates itself from the world, which it sees as in a fallen condition. Well, it turns out that this particular brand of Neoplatonism is rooted in the thought of the Syrian philosopher Iamblichus of Chalcis. And Iamblichus was somebody who saw that Platonic philosophy and pagan religious practices really are two sides of the same coin, and they inform each other, and to some degree they're the same, right? Because he sees that, metaphysically, the gods, they created the world, right? And they are uh, all good, omnibenevolent, omniscient, right? These are the gods of Plato, idealized beings, right? Rather than the gods of literal mythology, which these philosophers like Julian would allegorize and say that, all of those, racy stories, in Homer or whatnot are, they're allegories for more kind of metaphysical processes, right? And so the philosopher, based on Iamblichus and this kind of Neoplatonism, sees themselves as kind of a conduit by which the gods can essentially work about the salvation of humanity. Okay, because the idea is that by reconnecting with the gods through ritual activity, through ethical practices, you're in a sense becoming like the gods and reenacting their activity on earth. And what is the activity of the gods but is it's creative activity? It's recreating the cosmos, right? And so philosophers are those who are posed to be able to reenact the gods' activity, and they believe that ritual practice is essentially the way that not just they, but everybody else at any level of society enacts the god's activity in the world through ritual, okay, through religious practices, okay. And so this is what Julian believed, and Julian believed that he, in the position of Roman emperor, right, had the power to bring society back to these rites that they all need to practice at various levels to restore the prosperity and bring back the blessings of the gods and secure them. And so Julian doesn't spell it out like this, partly because he's not writing in Latin, but I believe that what he's doing is essentially re-achieving the Pax Deorum, right? Reconnecting with the gods so that they can guarantee, right, the preservation of the Roman Empire, because it is through the Roman Empire that the preservation and salvation of the human race can be enacted, right? Because it was to the Romans and it was to the Greeks before them that the gods disseminated their oracles, their various political constitutions, right, that allowed people uh, to to connect with the gods in the proper way, right? And so, is Julian a philosopher? Well, by many definitions, he is, though he himself denies that he's a philosopher. And I genuinely believe that he doesn't see himself in the same category as a philosopher. He believes that philosophers and rulers are two different categories. Philosophers are the ones that we think of as actually working kind of away from politics. They're the ones that are doing the rituals, connecting with the gods in their leisure time, right? Their otium. Okay. And that he as a ruler is essentially leaving the philosophers to do what they do, going to them for advice, right? on ethics, on ruling, right, on religion, right, and then disseminating their wisdom to the masses using his imperium, right, his platform to kind of disseminate the ideas of the philosophers, okay, for a wider audience, which is why he undertakes this campaign of writing, right, because he does have the rhetorical skills, okay, to do so.
This is really
Mhm.
interesting because when I was first thinking about Julian in preparation for this, because I admit my specialty is not in this century
Mhm.
whatsoever, that I was like, he does feel like he's embodying a little bit of the philosopher king. But in terms of what you're suggesting, because he sees that there's this real distinction between his role as a sort of conduit and the role of philosophy itself, then that doesn't seem like it could possibly be the
Mhm.
case. And yet it feels like there must have been a huge tension for him if the king emperor is meant to fulfill a certain role in relationship to the Pax Deorum, and that has not been happening properly for a couple of decades
Mhm.
now because of this shift to a different system, that there is potential to see his work as absolutely
Mhm.
vital to stabilizing the Roman Empire in its current
Mhm.
form and reinvigorating its potential as a leader within the Mediterranean
Mhm.
area.
Definitely.
Food for thought. All right, so we know that Julian wrote heaps of things, and we're never going to be able to have
Right.
time to discuss them all in this particular
Yep.
interview. Maybe if we did a whole series. But which of his writings do you think are the most
Mhm.
revealing?
So he's got, three lobe volumes of writings. His letters, he's got orations, what we might call satires, and kind of prose hymns to the gods that are sort of quasi-philosophical treatises as well as kind of philosophical invectives. But my favorite work is, and I think the most revealing, especially for the purposes of his identity as a ruler is the one that you two participated in, and that is the Caesars, right? Which has it's either called it was either originally called the Caesars or the Symposium, right? So I call it the Symposium of the Caesars. And what I like about this is, yeah, a lot of people read it as a satire and that this is not to be a very serious piece, but I think it's a lot more serious because, especially if we take the title Symposium, he's modeling this on a Platonic dialogue, right, on Plato's
Mm.
Symposium, and he's bringing in a lot of other influences from Plato's thought, and I believe that yes, he's using kind of a humorous medium, okay, because there's plenty of humor in Plato's dialogues too, right, in order to kind of convey a more serious message because he sets the thing during the Saturnalia where that the kind of point is to make merry and to kid around a bit, right? And he sees this as a religious obligation, right? This is what we're supposed to do in this season, okay? And so I feel like that dialogue, which I call it a dialogue because it's just it's a conversation, it's a series of speeches, right? That the god Hermes recounts to him about a banquet of the gods in the heavens where the divi, right, the deified Roman emperors are invited to this banquet, and the gods decide, let's hold a contest to see which of these emperors is actually worthy to ascend to the gods level. In other words, it's yes, these were deified by the Senate, okay, but which of them is really worthy of being an honorary god? Okay. And so they decide to have a contest of speeches, right? And they decide, well, let's just draw a short list. Okay. And the rulers that they pick are Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and Constantine. And then they also decide to bring in Alexander the Great just to see if any of them can measure up to kind of the
The
quintessential,
OG.
the OG quintessential kind of Greek ruler, right? And so they all give their speeches, and they all kind of try to criticize each other. And so this is Julian kind of using his powers of declamation to kind of embody a character. And then toward the end, there's a bit of cross examinations by the gods to kind of figure out, okay, well, you're rhetorically you said this, but what was your real like reason that motivated you as a ruler, and what do we say about that? And so Julius Caesar said, I wanted to be number one, and trade, and Alexander once was like, I want to conquer everybody, and Augustus interestingly says, well, I want to be a good ruler. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's another point
Hum,
for
hum, hum.
Augustus. Wait a
And
minute.
then Marcus Aurelius says, well, the point is to imitate the gods. That's what motivated me, right? And so Marcus Aurelius has the most kind of philosophical perspective on, well, to be a good ruler, you have to be like the gods, not compare yourself to the gods. That's hubris, but to act like the gods, in that the gods are wholly good, that they are they create and sustain the universe, right? They provide prosperity, okay, and things like that. And so what I like about this dialogue is that yes, Marcus Aurelius technically wins, but it's a bit more ambiguous than that, because also Augustus and some of the other kind of contestants, they say a lot of things that are revealing about Julian, that relate to Julian, especially Augustus. And I argue that Julian, has a lot more in common with Augustus that he reveals through this dialogue than he does with even Marcus Aurelius, the so-called kind of philosopher ruler before him, which of course he still admires. And the key to this dialogue that I think relates to his identity as a Roman ruler and his interest in presenting himself as Roman is the fact that the MC of this banquet of the gods is Romulus.
Mm.
Okay, he's the one that's throwing the Saturnalia party, and he's inviting all of his successors of the Caesars, right, to join him. And the point here is Romulus wants people to kind of come up to his level and, be worthy of kind of being a new Romulus.
Mm.
Okay. In order to ascend to the level of the gods like Romulus did, you have to have a career worthy of being a new Romulus, right? And this connects to the ideology of refoundation. Okay, that Roman rulers since Augustus and even Caesar, with Hellenistic precedents and stuff and Republican precedents before him, kind of put forth saying that, you want to be styled a new Romulus, a new founder of Rome, right? In order to kind of show that you are bringing Rome back to its proper foundations as a city, in terms of its values, its piety, its prosperity, right? So I don't know. Have you folks gotten to Camillus yet? Uh, you know,
I
Com-
was going to say, I hate to break it to Julian, but he really left a major person out here.
yeah,
Camilla should have been ruling this show.
yeah. Well, the thing is, he does refer to Camillus in the Caesars, okay,
Yeah.
and I think that's a key there. So, Julian is aware that other people, even in the Republic, have been styled second or third founders of Rome. He also,
Yeah.
other places, he alludes to Gaius Marius as such,
Sure.
because he's reading largely Greek sources like Plutarch, right, who are saying these things. And so Julian's picking up on that, and he's seeing people like Augustus, who very much kind of reinvigorated this ideology and adapted it for, for the Principate essentially, right? And so all of the kind of iconography where he associates himself with Romulus, with Numa Pompilius, and with Aeneas, right? All in his Forum, through the Aeneid, and certainly other things. And so I think Julian and many Roman emperors, between Augustus and Julian, were doing their own kind of spin on that. And I think Julian had a very idiosyncratic approach to this, because he tried to combine this very Roman ideology with his own kind of philosophical outlook, and the idea of theurgy, the idea of participating in the kind of the cosmogenesis of the gods, can be akin to refounding and renewing the empire. for the sake of humanity.
Yeah, I think who we choose to admire and how we work through that definitely says a lot about us. If Livy was writing this, it would have just been Camillus he was talking to. If the period that we're in at the moment says anything about that. So I'm really interested in these references to Romulus and Numa because in the way that they're often set up in the historiography, they kind of represent two different but important parts of being a Roman ruler, in that Romulus is generally seen as, more expansionist, a bit more aggressive, a bit more warlike, whereas Numa is definitely more the philosopher king style. So can we delve a little bit more into these figures and why they appeal to Julian at this much, much later time in Rome's history?
Definitely. So I think to start with the bigger context here, in the fourth century, when we are sort of seeing kind of the competition between pagan philosophers and Christian writers and whatnot over kind of what is kind of Roman identity. I think this is when we're seeing, say, people like Augustine and Arnobius, who are basically kind of looking at all of the things that Romulus and Numa did as very morally problematic as well as rather silly, right? They're kind of reading all of the Roman mythology literally about, the fratricides and the rape of the Sabine women and all the things that Numa did with Egeria and things like that. And they're saying, this is not these are the founders of pagan Rome, right? We're not people we should hold in high esteem. And so in reaction to that, I think a lot of the kind of the conservative pagans, who are trying to defend these traditions are trying to kind of dig down and reevaluate and see how can we kind of save the reputation of these founding fathers. And so Julian is participating in this, and one way he's doing this is through, as we said before, philosophical allegory and saying, well, this is a myth. This is mythology we're dealing with. We can't read this literally. Romulus, was not literally born of Mars and Rhea Silvia.
What?
Numa did not literally,
What?
have a fling with some nymph named Egeria to get all of his good ideas.
Excuse me.
What a killjoy, Julian.
And the reason he's interested in these figures is he's looking for authentically Roman models of rulership and of refoundation. These are the original founders. He wants to kind of aspire to reenacting their careers, right? And so, as you said, Romulus and Numa are these kind of dual models that, complementing each other, represent both the kind of the military and the kind of the domestic dimension of what a proper Roman ruler is, right? Domi militiae quae, right? And so the kind of the main text he uses to explore these two figures is his hymn to King Helios, right? So, like many people, many Roman emperors in the third and early fourth century, right, the sun god was, kind of his chief god, right? Before Constantine converted to Christianity, his family was devoted to Sol Invictus, okay, like emperors before. And so Julian is essentially kind of going back to the Sol Invictus thing, but seeing it through a more philosophical Greek lens, hence Helios Greek. And he's writing this as sort of a prose treatise that is kind of religiously charged, but it's really a piece of rhetoric, and where he's essentially almost creating a panegyric for the true emperor of the universe, which is Helios Basileus, right? King, emperor, son, right? Which is a very interesting kind of repositioning of Julian's own position, where, here's the emperor, but he is giving a speech of praise to the true emperor, right? So this is one way that Julian kind of, humbles himself, whereas a lot of other kind of his contemporaries and kind of ideology at the time would very much exalt the emperor to kind of semi-divine status, more the equal of Helios, right? Like Constantine would. Anyway, what he does in this treatise is he talks about how the founding of Rome and sort of the blessings of Rome come directly from Helios himself, and that the Romans and Rome are kind of have a special relationship with the sun god, and that through the power of the sun god, which was the creator of the universe, right, the Romans were destined to rule the world and to bring about the prosperity and salvation of the human race. Okay. And so, in order to kind of show this, he talks about the myth of Romulus being born. And he says that actually his soul kind of emanated from Helios himself, and by way of this kind of hierarchy of being, where you have the gods and then you have intermediary beings like daimones and heroes and angels and whatnot, and that actually he descended in what's called kind of a seira, a chain of being that kind of goes through specific kind of leader gods that are part of the 12 Olympians, and that he descended in the chain of Ares, okay, of Mars, and that a daimon in the chain of Ares was the one that sort of fashioned his mortal body, and thus he was born. And he talks about how, he descended during a kind of a conjunction of the sun and moon, and that's exactly how he also ascended back to the gods through lightning strikes, as they say. He said he wasn't actually, neither that he was killed by the Senate nor that he just disappeared and ascended. He was actually, his body was annihilated by lightning, and that his pure soul reascended to the gods, right?
Much more rock and roll. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Romulus is getting a good deal in this story. Yeah. Oh, imagine just a whole new origin story for Romulus and the potential to go back to the gods, which fits in nicely with this idea of his attachment to Quirinus and things like that. And so I like this interweaving of these tales.
Yeah. And, in order to kind of argue this, he's drawing a lot from he's reading mainly Greek sources for this, Plutarch's Life of Romulus and Dionysius's account, where, both Plutarch and Dionysius are all themselves rather skeptical of the more mythological, fantastical elements of this. And Julian is kind of using that and saying, well, hey, yes, we need to kind of look at this out more allegorically, right? So for Numa, he has some very interesting things to say about Numa, both in the Hymn to Helios as well as in his kind of polemic treatise against the Galileans, where he tries to argue that Christianity is bunk and that Hellenic Greco-Roman civilization is superior in every way. So in the Hymn to King Helios, when he talks about Numa, he basically shows that Numa's imposition of Roman religion was actually very much directed toward the worship of the sun, of Helios, that Roman religion was originally heliocentric. And he does some very fun things here, because he basically says that, well, Numa instituted a 12-month Roman solar calendar, and only the Romans and the Egyptians, of all the peoples, use a solar calendar. Everybody else uses a lunar calendar. Also, the Romans, they start the year at the winter solstice, right, which is the rebirth of the sun god, right? So this is a demonstration of the Romans' superior piety to the sun, right? Also, he reinterprets the cult of Vesta and the Vestal fire as essentially a solar cult, right? And this is
Wait a minute.
Yeah, and so
he's messing with your ladies,
right? Because he's basically, I mean, he would argue that all gods and goddesses are in a sense emanations and of the demiurge, the creator god, which is Helios. But anyway, so he basically looks at, and actually back to Camillus, there's a passage in Plutarch's Life of Camillus where he also refers to the relighting of the Vestal flame after a disaster, hence it's in the Life of Camillus. Right?
Naturally, yes.
And the thing is like, you can't just relight it with conventional ways. You actually have to focus mirrors on the wood so that pure sunlight reignites the wood. In other words, it's the same principle as Archimedes' death ray.
That sounds frustrating.
Yes.
It's a very important process.
And so Julian is reading this in Plutarch and saying, oh, that's because the Vestal flame is itself the fire from Helios, right? And that is the manifestation of Helios on Earth there, right? So that's what he says in the hymn to Helios, the stuff
Oh.
to do with the sun god. Also in Against the Galileans, based on what we can piece together, because it's one of these things like, it's similar to like Origen's Contra Celsum, where it's just quotations by some later Christian guy who doesn't like him and he's trying to argue against him. In this case, the Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, who is essentially the guy who was responsible for the murder of Hypatia. But let's not get into that. Let's see.
Boo.
Basically, Julian seems to be arguing that Numa spent most of his time in wandering in sacred groves, right, kind of outside the walls of Rome, in pure contemplation and communion with the gods, okay, through his pure thoughts, right? And this is how he derived the laws of Rome, or at least the prescriptions for Roman religion. Now, what seems to be going on is that Julian is likely allegorizing Numa's relationship with Egeria, right? Who was essentially his muse. And he's saying that, well, that's just an allegory for the fact that Numa was a master theurgist, okay, meaning that he was so good at kind of enacting these rituals to kind of elevate his soul into union with the gods that he didn't even have to do any sort of rituals. He could just do this completely with his mind, right? Because that's how exceptional a being he was. And so by kind of mind melding with the gods, as it were, right? He is able to just intuitively kind of know what their proper worship entails. Okay, and so he can be the ideal lawgiver, right, for the Romans. And it's not a coincidence that Julian soon after that talks about the Anciliae, the shields, right, that fell from heaven during his reign, okay, as sort of a token of that protection that the gods would give to Rome. And Julian even says that Zeus, right, Jupiter sent Numa because after Romulus's reign, with the expansion of Rome on all sides and it's sort of its military footing, suddenly, now, well, you have offense, now you need defense. And the best defense is religion, right? You need the gods to keep you safe, right? And that's why they sent Numa.
I have to say, you're making ancient history sound incredibly cool. Virgins using death rays, mind melding with the
Yeah.
gods.
Look, I think it's really interesting how he's drawing all of these strings back to the sun,
Mhm.
and I find this exceptionally fascinating because obviously that taps into ideas about solar deities that have sort of arisen in the Roman
Mhm.
Empire, and allows him to sort of be like, but have you considered over here? And so rather than taking people right away from the ideas and beliefs that maybe they've held on to for quite some time, is suggesting that there's maybe a new angle to look at these things from as a way of strengthening what they already
Mhm.
have. And I think this is a good moment to switch focus a little bit, because Julian has all of these amazing ideas, and I'm sure there's others as well that we haven't even touched upon yet, but he doesn't have necessarily huge support from other writers
Mhm.
necessarily. And I'm wondering how they have crafted a different type of Julian for
Mhm.
us in the source
Mhm.
material.
Well, during his reign, he has some, rhetorical firepower in his arsenal beside his own, through various proponents of him, the orators, the Libanius and Mamertinus and Hymerius kind of are the main ones that are kind of using kind of praise oratory to support his rule and his program and to kind of create consensus with their various communities to buy into what Julian's doing. And they're presenting Julian in I argue, significantly different ways than how is Julian is presenting himself, right? So Julian is presenting himself kind of to using kind of the language of his own, what literary theorists call interpretive community, right, of pagan Neoplatonists, right, who kind of understand what he's really doing. Whereas a lot of these other orators, right, they're not as into philosophy, or they're more kind of using kind of the more traditional ideology of late antique emperorship, which does raise the emperor to a semi-divine level. Okay, Libanius, who is not a philosopher and sees Julian doing this philosophy stuff, is definitely seeing him as a Platonic philosopher king, right? Mamertinus, interestingly, his orations are in Latin, and he's actually showing that Julian is very much a new Augustus figure, right? Restoring the Republic, but not just restoring the Republic, but actually creating something even better, which is, we have libertas, but we also have monarchy that actually guarantees libertas better than the Republic did. So it's a very interesting kind of thing that late antique panegyric's doing. But he certainly had plenty of enemies that would try to kind of reframe what he was doing. Certainly his Christian contemporaries, probably the most well-known is Bishop Gregory of Nazianzus, right? Who he actually seems to have been a school buddy of his back when he studied in Athens for a couple months back in 355 before he was elevated to junior emperor. And so they kind of studied rhetoric together. And so it's interesting that, at the end of Julian's reign and soon after he died, Gregory came out and just launched these series of invectives against Julian, basically calling him, the devil, the serpent, right? This very satanic figure who is basically thinks that he's the great philosopher when in fact he's just a great sorcerer, right? And it's all sophistry, and he has no clear idea of the truth, and what he's actually doing is he's not actually refounding the empire, but he's undermining its foundations by essentially going after the Christianity, which Gregory and many people believed was actually a unifying force for the empire, right? Under this universal faith. And so this is sort of where the epithet of apostates, of apostate, comes from. And we kind of learn of apostate meaning someone who abandons the traditional religion, but the verb aphistemi in Greek doesn't just mean to kind of step away, but it means to rebel. Okay. And so I think in the original context of him using that word, it's like it's Julian the rebel. Okay. He is rebelling against God, right? He's trying to see that he's sort of this satanic figure, right? Who's doing very much what Lucifer did, right? And that kind of shifts your perspective a bit. It also makes sense because, in the Byzantine period, is where we see that Julian is also starting to be referred to as hoparavatis, okay, which is what he's called in modern Greek today, which is transgressor, the violator, which I think is actually pretty cool, right? If you think about it that way.
It does give a negative vibe.
I don't know if I want to be known as the violator.
It is a bit of a criticism, though. Yeah. It doesn't, yeah. I mean, I would surely, if somebody were to call me those things, I'd probably try to embrace those titles and be like, yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
But I can see how it's not really working out maybe so well for Julian if he's not there to defend himself against those kinds of assertions.
But it's funny, though, because this is sort of what kind of the Christian line of attack is on him, from the pony he drops dead all the way through, the Byzantine period and beyond. But the thing is that, well, then why do we have so many of his writings preserved? Wouldn't they just damnatio memoriae him and, pretend he never existed or something like that? Well, no, it's because, even during the Byzantine period, people were able to separate the Julian the pagan from Julian the writer, and even Julian the emperor. Plenty of people are like, oh, he was obviously very misguided religiously, but he was such a great writer. And honestly, he wasn't a bad emperor either. He was a decent general. He had a lot of sensible policies. He was a lover of his country, right? As Gibbon says. But man, he was a great writer and a very entertaining writer and a witty writer. And so, injecting lots of mythology and references to history and philosophy, of course. And so it's kind of, he's a nice example to show you that, the preservation of Greek literature, even by people like Julian, right? People were, the Byzantine Empire was not, everybody wasn't like super Orthodox religious. It was a lot more secular than we take it for. And that's why, so much of this, of pagan Greek literature, including his, was preserved there. So even the most, Christian of societies, still, saw some value in him and was able to I don't want to say separate the art from the artist, but that's sort of what they did.
Look, it does make me hopeful, but I still can't forgive whoever it was who decided not to preserve Agrippina's memoirs.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a bad day. Dear. But look, this is really interesting. So we thought about Julian's own writings. We've now looked at what some of the people who supported him and opposed him have said about him. But there is another aspect that we can consider, which of course is the archaeological sources that survive. So things like coins, do we see much of a contrast between what appears in the archaeological record and what is preserved in these writings we've been talking about?
That's an excellent question. And again, this kind of brings us back to kind of the idea that Julian's own writings are, the closest we get to kind of Julian himself. Now, he probably dictated most of this to a scribe, so there's already sort of a layer of abstraction there. But compared to many other sources that are attached to him during his reign, right, the writings of him that in his own name seem to be the ones that where I see this kind of authorial persona that is consistent, right, throughout.
Sure.
Now, coins, inscriptions, even laws are much more the product of other people at work within the imperial administration and elsewhere. So coins, for instance, right, are being minted throughout the empire. And the people in charge of the mints, all the way up to the minister of finance, the comes sacrarum lagrationum, right, in the imperial consistory, right, is a separate person who has a lot of power in dictating how and what the imperial image is going to be disseminated to these mints. And of course, these individual mints are going to kind of have their own choices to make, right? It's not like today where you can just send a picture on the internet and say mint a coin that looks like this, right? And so a lot of the minting of his coins are going to try to make him look very much like a traditional emperor in his dynasty, right, for the sake of his legitimacy. Okay, but they're also going to be a lot based on the interpretation of others of kind of how he would want to be perceived, right? So that is not to say Julian did not have a hand in this. Okay, he probably did for some of his coinage at least, right? So for instance, his earlier coinage as Augustus, he's growing a beard, right? He was clean shaven, when he was Caesar, kind of under the thumb of the Constantinian dynasty, trying to look like Constantine and all of the emperors who are essentially baby faced because they want to appear with this Apollonian divine youth to separate themselves from the common people, whereas Julian's like, no, I'm just like everybody else, right? I'm a soldier. I want to look like my fellow soldiers, right? And so that's what he's doing. And of course, the beard is also associated with philosophy, with Hellenism, with paganism, okay, at this point. And so that's also kind of what he's doing there. And so he's certainly, I think, approving of that. And he also has a lot of kind of military imagery on his coinage, which is not unusual, but he seems to step it up more than before. There's coins where he's got a helmet, he's got a helmet and he's holding a spear, right? Which is something you haven't really seen since sort of the days of Constantine fighting with the tetrarchs and stuff. So again, coins, are a product of kind of a committee and the various mints. Inscriptions are an even further remove because the majority of inscriptions that we have, at least for Julian, are not the result of top-down processes where, the emperor or the consistory, disseminates these are the inscriptions that need to be posted. No, these are bottom up sort of initiatives where city councils, local magistrates, right, are going to be putting up these inscriptions in order to advertise their loyalty, right, to the emperor, especially to a new emperor, right? we see throughout the fourth century and before that whenever kind of a new emperor shows up, even after, especially after like a civil war or something like that, a lot of milestones show up with inscriptions, that are honoring the new emperor, whether you need a new milestone or not. Okay, this happened with Magnentius, who was kind of a usurper emperor for a while, and it happens with Julian. And we have other sort of inscriptions, statue bases that kind of present Julian as, philosopher king, kind of this semi-divine figure. Whereas in the West, with the Latin inscriptions, we see kind of a combination of some of the kind of traditional rhetoric of refoundation, right? He's the restorer of the Republic, right? He brought back freedom, libertas, securitas, things like that. Though interestingly, we also see that combined with kind of titles like restorer of the temples, restorer of the sacred rites. Okay, so clearly people are writing things that will certainly appeal to him, but also perhaps reflecting a genuine conviction that his restoration of paganism was popular, right, throughout the empire. Okay, and that obviously this is speculative history and not real history, but if he had reigned as long as Constantine and his sons had did, who knows? Things may have been different. And the whole idea that Christianity was inevitable at that point is not, I'm not so certain. Okay, it only really became inevitable, ironically, because of his death. Because his death sort of proved, quote unquote, to the Christians and everybody that, oh, see, God didn't want him to
We
live
were
and do
right.
this, right?
Yeah.
And so this sort of vindicates us rhetorically.
Yeah.
I'm glad Julian himself did not live to see that.
He would have been so angry. That day between the moment he gets the spear and the point that he dies, I can just imagine he's like, I'm so furious. And it's like,
Yeah,
I was just
God
building
damn
up
it.
to something really great. And now. So we know that he is writing in Greek and he definitely knows Greek, probably long before he knows Latin, in spite of what he might claim. So I'm wondering, what is his relationship with the city of Rome actually like, given the nature of imperial rule at this point in time?
Well, so this is, the kind of the post Diocletian kind of situation where, traditionally a lot of people think that the city of Rome kind of fades in importance in terms as a capital, and it's simply just sort of symbolic capital rather than any sort of practical administrative capital. And while it is true that emperors are largely kind of holding court in places closer to the frontier in the east, etc., like in Constantinople, right? They are still holding Rome in great honor and visiting Rome on special occasions and kind of affirming that this is still the supreme city. And so Julian is doing this just as much, if not more so, than before, because starting with Constantine and then his sons, there's also kind of this new city on the block called Constantinople, where Julian was actually born, but is also where Julian kind of, when he was about 5 or 6 years old, saw most of his family murdered by his cousin in a great purge of this branch of Constantine's family that, his cousins sort of resented. And so I always think that Julian had an ambivalent relationship with Constantinople and kind of associated it with his uncle, with his cousins, and their adoption of Christianity. And they see that Constantinople is a sort of, this is not a traditional city that like Rome or Athens or Sparta or Alexandria even, right? And so we need to kind of go back to honoring kind of the old pagan cities that are more associated with kind of the good old days of classical Greece and Rome, right? And so Julian kind of incorporates Rome into his kind of vision of what should be preeminent. And so he presents himself as if, he knows a lot about Rome. He is the Pontifex Maximus. He seems to demonstrate a familiarity with the religious topography of Rome, the various temples, the various religious practices. He is associating with pagan Roman senators, okay, who have high, religious functions, and he knows Latin. right? He learned Latin to command the army, to do administration and law, and it seems that he had quite a facility with it and could read it. It was not his preferred language to write literature, which was Greek, but he certainly embraced kind of the duties of a Roman emperor very seriously. So with the city of Rome, it's interesting because he never went there. And so a lot of people say, oh, he just wasn't actually that interested in Rome, right? He was more interested in Greece, right? Because he's Greek. But the thing is that I think he would have visited Rome at the first opportunity, because when he was growing up as sort of a prince in the house of Constantine, and as someone who had his own potential political prospects, his cousin, the Augustus, they didn't want him to go to Rome. He didn't want him to develop his own relationships with the senatorial aristocracy, who might help him challenge him in a bid for power, right? Constantius wanted to monopolize the Senate of Rome and to look to him. And so eventually, when Julian is called to power to become a Caesar, he's sent to Gaul to kind of manage and campaign against the Germanic, quote unquote, barbarians and guard the frontier. And so he's just doesn't have the leisure to go to Rome. And then finally, when he becomes emperor after a brief civil war, or abortive civil war, bloodless civil war, essentially, with Constantius before he dies, at that point, he's already in the East, where he was about to fight Constantius. And at that point, he's like, okay, I need to consolidate power in the East because I already have done so in the West. So he needs to stay in the East, stay in Constantinople while consolidate power there, and then go East and win a victory against Persia, because the Eastern armies used to be loyal to Constantius, who was his rival, and now he needs to lead them to victory so that he can secure their loyalty and power in the eastern part of the empire. Once he does that, I think he would have gone to Rome. I think he would have gone to Rome and might have even celebrated a triumph, because what Julian accomplished in Persia before he died was arguably could be spun as a victory. He thrashed the Persians, stormed several cities, he beat them in kind of a minor battle. He didn't have like a major showdown with kind of the Persian Shah's army, but he still gave him quite a beating, and he basically just had to go back to Roman territory for the winter, right? And probably would have perhaps campaigned the next year, but he was ambushed on the way back. It was a very hard retreat. They were harassed by the Persians the whole way with their whole scorched earth kind of thing, right? It's the whole he's not the first Roman emperor or Roman general to go into that area and have a hard time going in or out. And so
Yes.
he could have potentially spun kind of, his accomplishments in Persia as a victory enough to warrant going to Rome and celebrating a triumph, because actually the year 364 would have been his decennalia, because because he would have counted when he became Caesar in 355, and because of the counting inclusively, right, 364 would have been the year. And so that would have been an occasion to go, as other emperors like Diocletian, for instance, would have gone on his vicenalia and things like that, or tricennalia. Of course, that's all speculative, but I think it would have made perfect sense given Julian's interest in Rome and what an emperor would have done in those circumstances at the time.
The tragedy. It just makes me even sadder that he gets
gone too soon,
speared by the Persians. I know.
Well, if you want to read a story about that has Julian in Rome, the Julian romance, the Syriac Julian romance, which came out later and does not view him favorably at all, has a seed in which Julian is in Rome, and he's basically, I think he's like trying to like force the Pope or something to recant Christianity and become pagan or something, but he's unsuccessful, and there's all these miracles, and he looks like a fool. So that's about the closest
well, I mean,
we get.
He is the devil. He's got to give it a shot.
Right, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on the show. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and have made me aware that I don't understand ancient philosophy in the degree that I probably need to. But yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. If you want to pick up the book, people, or just a reminder, it is Julian Augustus, Platonism, Myth, and the Refounding of Rome. Is there anything else you'd like to plug before we sign off, Jeremy?
Yes. So as you mentioned, and as I've been on the show before to talk about, I have also the interest in heavy metal and the reception of antiquity. And so what I would like to plug is the fact that hopefully next year I will be putting out a double volume co-authored edited volume with Charlotte Naylor Davis and Shama Boyarin called Pre-Modern Worlds in Heavy Metal Music. Okay, and this is essentially 25 chapters based on a couple conferences we ran. It's basically a series of scholars in various disciplines, Egyptologists, classicists, Byzantinists, okay, people working on linguistics and medievalists, school teachers, music journalists, musicians themselves, musicologists, looking at various aspects of heavy metal music's reception of pre-modern mythology, history, literature, art, etc. And so it'll be published with Palgrave Macmillan in their Pop Music Identity and Culture series, hopefully next year, 2027. So I'm very excited that we're getting this out.
Yeah, it sounds thrilling. I'm really excited to have a read of it when it comes out. And thank you so much for spending this time with us and taking us into part of Rome's history that we are just so far away from in the rest of our podcast, but is incredibly fascinating.
It is like a foreign world in some ways.
And, thanks. And it's such a far remove from, the early Roman history and the mythology beyond it that you deal with, that in a sense it is similar to kind of what I do with the heavy metal stuff. It's reception, right? What Julian's doing is he's looking at the founding of Rome and its myths, right, as something that was very much ancient, as we see Julian as ancient. I really like how it kind of comes back to the beginning like that. And heavy metal's about that too. Heavy metal's always about going back to primordial times, right? Going back to the beginning where everything is full of myth and magic.
Oh.
Yeah, before there were rules, man.
Julian might also be a heavy metal fan, I would imagine. I would like to believe that.
All right, well, thank you so much. Listeners, make sure you pick up a copy. It is an incredible read. The depth that you go into is quite extraordinary.
Yep, thank you very much. And thanks again for the opportunity to have me back. This is a lot of fun. Yep.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon and Ko-Fi. We've also published 2 books on ancient Roman history. Rex, the 7 Kings of Rome, examines the different literary accounts of the earliest rulers recorded in Roman history. Your cheeky guide to the Roman Empire is full of the sorts of stories the Romans wished you didn't know about them, and is guaranteed to make for interesting conversation. Thank you to all our Patreon supporters. We are truly humbled by your patronage.